consistent for critical infrastructure. By aggregating the geospatial information on infrastructure, we developed the Critical Infrastructure Spatial Index. The CC is a measure for the spatial density of critical infrastructure in relative terms, ranging between 0, being no infrastructure, and 1, being the highest infrastructure density. The dataset has major potential to be used in a range of applications, for example, for the identification of hotspots of critical infrastructure and for rapid and high-level risk assessments, but also as a supporting tool to identify areas that lack infrastructure data. I want to conclude with an overview of topics that I'm currently working on. We are currently working on reviewing the current literature on vulnerability data that specifically describe the relationship between physical damage and a hazard measure, such as flood inundation. This data will then be used for multi-hazard risk assessment at the global scale. Here we aim to provide first global estimates of expected annual damages due to flooding, earthquakes, tropical cyclones, and landslides. And lastly, we will also develop projections of infrastructure using socio-economic pathways. And if you want to learn more about my research, I invite you to rule number 1.
Thank you very much. Perfectly on time. Evelyn, please. Are you having trouble sharing your screen? Yes. Thomas, could you enable Evelyn sharing her screen?
It should.
Okay, now we see your screen.
Now you see my screen, right?
Yes, now we see the the main desktop. Yeah, now presentation, right. But you should swap display.
Sorry about that. All right.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. I'm Evelyn. I'm a PhD student at the Weather and Climate Risks Group. And what I want to talk about today is my work on developing a impact modeling chain that's aimed at capturing basic service disruptions in a globally consistent natural hazard impact model. So after a natural disaster, what usually happens and what has like most impacts directly on people is that very often critical infrastructures and hence the resulting basic services are disrupted. That could be communities being cut off by roadways, not having telecommunication services, being out of power, or people dying in the aftermath because you couldn't reach a hospital in time. So at the essence of my research question, it is, after a disaster, what basic services are people lacking and where are those people that lack what kinds of basic services? So bridging basically this gap from disaster footprint to basic services is what's at my research question. And what we implemented was a model that can cope with large scales, that is national scales, using only publicly available data sources, and that works consistently across the globe. So how are we doing this? If you think about such a chain, there's basically 4 vital steps that need to be considered. It starts at having a natural hazard footprint. Then you obviously need critical infrastructure data that is impacted. Given that critical infrastructures, however, has a network character and often depends on each other, that then initiates failure cascades. You need an infrastructure failure model. And last but not least, those infrastructure failures need to be translated into human-centric impacts. So coming from a natural hazard modeling perspective, what is very typical is that those models stop at asset damages, whereas in the infrastructure modeling world, very often failure models are very small scale, detailed, and proprietary, whereas human impacts are generally not very often considered. So the good notice is that basically we do have approaches both from the natural hazard community and from the infrastructure modeling community that can be used to bridge this. And well, if you want to learn more about how we concretely did this in an open source model and how we fared with a first case study and the model validation, come join me together with Sadhana in room 1. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Perfectly on time. Now we move to David Nortes Martinez.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Good. We see your screen, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm David Nortes, postdoctoral researcher at INRAE, Montpellier in France. Non-structural flood control measures, such as floodplains, are being implemented to protect urban and industrial territories. However, this is increasing the exposure of rural communities and transferring risk to agricultural areas whose revenues depend on land productivity. Now, financially speaking, can those local communities and productive systems overcome the impacts of floods over their livelihood? To answer this question, we built a simulation model focusing on a local and cooperative wine production chains that groups farmers and a winery. This model allows us to simulate the production dynamics between these two main agents during the year for several consecutive years. The model also allows us to simulate flood events of different magnitude in different times of the year, tracking down direct impacts to farmer and the winery, as well as the indirect impact rippling both through time and across the network. Using it as a virtual laboratory, we are able to evaluate how different flood events affect the network and the cash flow of the farmers. Throughout our simulations, we find that factors such as the initial treasury of farmers or the flexibility of creditors to influence the capacity of farmers to cope with the impacts of floods as we can intuitively think. More interestingly, though, we also find that cooperative wineries may reduce or amplify the impacts of floods over the farmers through the cost revenue sharing rule and the rigidity of their cost structure. Furthermore, the impact that flood timing has over the system should not be underestimated, as agricultural activities and the transformation of their products vary along the year. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be pleased to further discuss the details of this work with you all in the breakout room.
Thank you, David. You're making my life very easy here because you're all the time. So now we move to room 2, modeling social and ecological vulnerabilities. Actually, Chris Fairless is unfortunately sick, so we move to Emily Quiroga. Very good. We see your screen, Emily. Please go ahead.
You see, okay, thank you. So my work is called Vulnerabilities of a Socio-Ecological System through the lens of a bioeconomic model. This is a work that is embedded in the Say project and a work that I also did with my colleague Benjamin Blancs. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, we wanted to show, like, for example, in a fishery socio-ecological system, we have the ecological system and we have that certain environmental conditions affect these ecological systems, like, for example, changes in stock, climate change, pollution. We have that also economic system is exposed to several impacts, like changes in government, social crisis, changes in prices, and also we have another socio-cultural system, which also can be impacted by changes in preferences, in tradition, and culture. So among all of these impacts that we have from different sides, one impact, we know that they had a cascading effects in another subsystems. So we want to develop a framework to know how vulnerable a socio-ecological system is. And among all of these possible impacts and drivers, which of them is the most important? Answering these questions are relevant because, for example, a policymaker can allocate certain resources depending on what is more important to affect the variable or the focus that they want to assess. So we develop a framework and we apply it to the North Sea fishery. So first of all, we choose a bioeconomic model that integrates ecological and economic subsystems. we define the property that we want to analyze. So among all of these socio-ecological systems, we decided to analyze the vulnerability of fishers' profits. We wanted to focus in economic viability. We identified the drivers that we want to be analyzed. So we analyzed the vulnerability of fishers' profits to changes in harvesting properties, ecological properties, and market properties. Then we decided to calibrate this bioeconomic model to real data. So we make that model simulations are closer to what we have. And we found the vulnerabilities of fishers' profits to multiple drivers. We apply our framework. So with our results, we show that our framework is able to quantify impact of different drivers, also distinguish between positive and negative impacts. Quantifies also adaptive capacities and disentangled sensitivities, adaptive capacities, and vulnerabilities. We found that among all of these impacts, the highest impact on fishers' profits is given by fixed costs, wages, place prices, and social preference. Also, we found that fishers can best adapt in decrease in wages. So thank you for your attention. And if you want to know more about this framework, so you are welcome in room number 2.
Thanks, Emily. Now we move to Qinxue Wang.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I share my. Okay.
Great. We can see your screen.
Okay.
Maybe if you move to presentation mode.
Okay. And yes, my research is modeling the integrated impacts of both climate change and also anthropogenic disturbance on the pasture green capacity and its vulnerability.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you please swap your screen so we can see your slides better? Because
sorry?
If you could, now we see, you probably have 2 screens. So now we are seeing your.
Sorry.
Like if you share your screen, go to presentation mode on PowerPoint, like you did before.
Okay. Okay. Here.
Oh, good.
Can you see?
Now we see it.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sorry. Because this very important index of green capacity and the vulnerabilities influenced by both climate change, cultivation, mining, urbanization, transportation, and many kinds of factors impact these 2 important indicators. So we try to establish the model to simulate this very important indicators. So, for example, the models, including the climate factors and also the neighbor, the livestock and the area pastures, or many factors, and then we can get to the green capacity and also green pressure, and also finally to get to the vulnerability index. So we use this model to get a lot of data sets to simulate the model, include the daily variation of the many climate factors and hydrologic factors. And then we also get the data of the livestock every year for each demonstration regions. So we use these data sets to get the vulnerability index of whole countries. We can get a conclusion that we have successfully developed a model to evaluate the green capacity and the vulnerabilities. And we found the areas surround the cities and mining areas, the effect of the anthropogenic disturbance overweight the impact of climate change. So we are now trying to use this model to assess the effectivity of the adaptation strategies, such as promote the water use efficiency to enhance the forage use efficiency, and to manage the livestock neighbors to reduce the green pressures. Thank you so much. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Now we move to room 3, modeling multi-hazards. Hasibun Nair. Are you here, Hasibun? Well, it seems not to be the case. So then we move to Judith Claassen.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I'll share my screen. See my screen now?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Judith. I'm a PhD candidate at the IVM in Amsterdam. And under the supervision of Philip Ward, Elke Cox, Marleen de Ruiter, and Timothy Tickelhofer, I'm doing research on the joint probabilities of global historic hazards, a multi-hazard perspective. Now, initially, I was going to have my research on Europe only, but recent events made me shift focus. And many of you will actually recognize one of these recent events. This is the hugely devastating, but also very interesting volcanic explosion that occurred last month in Tonga. And I'll use this eruption as an example in this presentation. So if we look at the world map, the Tonga eruption occurred here in the South Pacific. And not only did it lead to a tsunami in Tonga itself, but also to here in Santa Cruz in California, as you can see in the image, as well as off the coast of Peru and Japan. And in Tonga, as they were hit by a volcanic eruption and a tsunami, they were in desperate need of foreign aid. Unfortunately, the foreign aid delivered not only delivered the water supply, but also delivered corona, which they hadn't had before. And this made it even more difficult for them to recover. And this really shows how the interaction between several hazards has a higher impact than a single hazard on its own. So as we've seen from the Tonga example, a volcanic eruption can be linked to a tsunami, but only 5% of the times a tsunami occurs, this is actually linked to a volcanic eruption. And more often than not, it's due to an earthquake. So if we zoom into this earthquake and we look at the relationship between the earthquake magnitude and the wave height, we see that usually with a higher magnitude, there's also a higher wave height. And we can model this and simulate this using copulas. And there we can actually see, okay, what are the probabilities based upon a certain earthquake magnitudes that we're going to have a particular wave height? For example, what's the probability that if we have a magnitude of 9, that, for example, the wave height is above 20 meters? Now, you can not only relate the earthquake magnitude to the wave height, but you can also make this relationship between volcanic eruptions and a tsunami, as well as between all three of them. And ultimately, the idea is to make a Bayesian network where you can look at all the joint multi-hazards and the probabilities between these different hazards, which I'll be doing in my research. Now, as the color of my slides already gave away, my research is part of the Myriad EU project. And if you are interested in multi-hazards, I highly recommend you check out our website, and I can further elaborate on my research in the discussion session. Thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Judith. Now we move to room 4, modeling drought impacts. Rasha Hassan just told us that he's sick, so he couldn't be here. So we move to Imam Babayan. Iman, are you here? It seems not to be the case, which means that then we can cancel room 4. Well, we are actually unbelievably almost 10 minutes ahead of time, which is very good. So I would suggest to, yes, go into the breakout rooms, and then we will meet at 2:15 in the Zoom webinar for the session on modeling its impacts on health. Maybe just a clarification, there is no formal sharing in the breakout rooms. So we really, let's say, encourage others and participants to just keep it alive, and most importantly, to try to make sure that each other gets a fair share of time for presenting their work. With that, I would say we can start joining the rooms, and thank you very much.